The trial of Leo Frank. Quote, "Their defense of Frank was largely an asserting of his and, by extension, their own whiteness." End quote. Dr. Stuart Rockoff, director of the Goldring/Woldenberg Institute of Southern Jewish Life and the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience. Quote, "Much about Frank's life signified his whiteness. The African-American servants who worked in the home he and his wife shared with her parents, his control of poor African-Americans and whites in the National Pencil Company factory, and his conversion of an empty jail cell next to his into a parlor to greet visitors, all indicated that Frank was a bourgeois white man." End quote. Jeffrey Melnick. Leo Frank's murder trial began on July 28, 1913, and was the longest and most expensive criminal trial in Georgia state history up to that time. From gavel to gavel, it lasted 29 days. More than 300 witnesses were subpoenaed, and the transcript of court testimony amounted to 1,080,060 words. World War I was raging, but it had to share Atlanta's front pages with Leo Frank. Aspects of the murder investigation, the trial, and the events that followed were in many respects just as ugly as the murder. There were claims that witnesses were tortured, that affidavits and confessions were forged, that bribery was rife, that perjury was rampant, and that false evidence was planted. Witnesses testified, then recanted their testimonies, and then recanted their recantations. There were illegal arrests and detentions. Public access to the prisoners, witnesses, and evidence. Multiple and competing public and private investigations. High crimes, misdemeanors, and blatant conflicts of interest. There was even, yes, a bloody glove. Attorneys openly expressed their anti-black racism in the courtroom and to the press, and the trial proceedings were infused with lurid accounts of sex and violence. Other issues lurked just beneath the surface of the Leo Frank case. Child factory labor, class-based North-South animosities, pedophilia, and sexual deviance, and the widespread indignation over the criminal outrage committed against a poor daughter of the South. Ironically, the only social sin that was almost completely absent from the trial was that which many Jews would later claim dominated the proceedings: anti-Semitism. Despite all of the above, the trial of Leo Frank itself maintained a relatively sturdy judicial form. Indeed, a close analysis of the official trial record and the extensive day-by-day media accounts reveals the trial of the B'nai B'rith president may have been the fairest ever seen in an American Southern courtroom. A long-experienced Judge Leonard S. Roan presided, and the prosecutor for the state of Georgia, Hugh M. Dorsey, had presented his case against Leo Frank to a grand jury, 5 of whose members were Jews, who in turn handed up the murder indictment. The trial was conducted, as was all public business in Atlanta, within the strict racial guidelines decreed by Jim Crow. Whites swore on a whites-only Bible. Blacks swore on a separate, quote, Negro Bible, end quote, with those of the Jewish faith swearing on the white one. Frank entered the courtroom at the head of an army of attorneys, the ADL counting at least 8. Among his lead attorneys was Herbert J. Haas, a B'nai B'rith member who hailed from one of Atlanta's most prominent families of German Jewish aristocrats. Haas chose 2 prominent Gentile lawyers to conduct Frank's courtroom defense: the legendary cross-examiner Luther Z. Rosser and the unyielding Georgia Bulldog Reuben R. Arnold, both fully ensconced in the Southern justice system and fully accepting of its legal vagaries. They had but one assignment: to wrap a formidable legal noose around the black neck of the state's prime witness, James Jim Conley. The Georgian could not wait for this, quote, most thrilling situation, end quote. Quote, Anyone who has seen a witness made the object of Rosser's attack knows that Jim Conley is in for a bad day when he is called to the stand. Rosser's plan opens up the dramatic possibility of a courtroom confession from Conley." End quote. Luther Rosser came with an additional advantage for the defense. He had once been Judge Roan's law partner, and he had recently welcomed a new attorney and partner into his law firm, the newly elected governor of Georgia, John M. Slayton. Even at this early stage, it escaped no one's notice that Slayton's occupying the state's highest office carried with it the pardon power to override an adverse verdict. And though Governor Slayton had, by law, distanced himself from the firm, he yet maintained an office there with his name still inscribed on the door. And all those substantial benefits would prove to be useful as events unfolded. Frank himself assisted his defense team as they chose an all-white, all-male jury of 12 from a pool of 96, rejecting all blacks out of hand. It was an ironic element at the opening of a trial in which the contribution of blacks would prove pivotal to his legal fate. Black power on the witness stand. Quote, "We do not give testimony in front of him. We do not summons him to be a witness. And we do not accept testimony from him." End quote. The Talmud, Pesachim 49b. Quote, "My character has been blackened by those who sought my conviction." End quote. Leo Frank. Quote, "You can't get a man with Anglo-Saxon blood to admit he lied. He has pride. I have never seen one admit he lied. No matter where he is born, he has that same Anglo-Saxon pride. Now, with a Negro, it is different. He will admit he lied. Jim Conley, without any character to protect, lied this way and lied that." End quote. Luther Rosser, closing argument. Atlanta was in the midst of a heat wave as the trial of Leo Frank got underway. Readers of William Randolph Hearst's Upstart, Atlanta Georgian, would have seen the bold headline above the masthead. Quote, "Trial of Leo Frank begins." End quote. And beneath they would find a much smaller but infinitely more grotesque reminder of exactly where they were geographically and historically. Quote, "Dunbar is quiet after lynching." End quote. The brief notice detailed how members of a mob of Georgia Caucasians chased Negro John Sake into a swamp and, quote, "strung him up to a pole and literally riddled his body with bullets." End quote. In 4 speedy paragraphs describing an even speedier affair, another black man was tried, convicted, sentenced, and executed by a white mob that, quote, "dispersed immediately, and not a clue remains." End quote. 50 more such beastly racial attacks would occur in America in 1913. Blacks were as horrified as whites were pleased that their justice system worked so efficiently. Most assuredly, the blacks whose testimony would be prominently featured in the days to come understood what was at stake. The contrast between America's two, quote, "systems of justice," end quote, could not have been made clearer. Prosecutor Hugh Manson Dorsey opened with a careful and systematic presentation of the state's theory of the crime. He had amassed a body of circumstantial evidence against the defendant that was fortified with scores of witnesses and with the physical evidence of bloodstains and hair. He would argue that a violent event had occurred on the second floor, where Leo Frank's office was located, and that Mary Fagan was never seen alive again after she had met with her boss. That evidence had been enough to convince Frank's own hired private eyes of his guilt. And, more important, it was enough to generate an indictment from a grand jury with several Jewish members. Now Dorsey would put that evidence to the ultimate test in front of a jury. The pencil company employee who discovered Mary Fagan's body in the factory basement in the early morning hours of April 27th. The much maligned, falsely accused, and nearly lynched night watchman was sworn in and entered into the official record as, quote, Newt Lee, colored, end quote. Colored was a persecutional tag that Leo Frank would never have to countenance or confront. When Lee was sworn and able to present his account of the episode, his testimony was so forthright, his demeanor so self-assured, that the Atlanta Constitution's reporter felt compelled to observe that even under Luther Rosser's legendary cross-examination, Lee stuck to his original story, in the minutest detail. Questions that would have confused or befuddled a man of education failed to budge him from the statement he originally made to the police. Quote, seasoned courthouse officials and old reporters marveled at the way the Negro held out against the crossfire of questions, all aimed to confuse him. End quote. And with a confident and entirely reasonable self-defense, Newt Lee unloosed the rope from his own neck and slammed the door on Leo Frank's intention to make him complicit for the crime he simply discovered. In fact, it was Frank alone who had continued to target his former night watchman, goading the police and the city newspapers to keep the suspicion of Lee alive. But as the murder investigation pressed forward, nearly all involved, from the chief of police to the newspapermen to the private investigators, publicly proclaimed Lee's innocence several weeks before the trial. Atlanta's chief of detectives, Newport Lanford, was clear. Quote, Lee has completely been eliminated from the case as a suspect, and is now counted as one of the strongest witnesses against Frank. There is not the slightest doubt of the innocence of Newt Lee. I'm certain he has told all he knows of the death of Mary Fagan. End quote. Now at trial, Lee could speak for himself. So effectively did Newt Lee rebuff the Frank team's maneuver that the newspapers were speculating his release from custody might occur within a couple of days. Thus, on the very first day of his trial, Frank was given his first cold reality check by the very black man he had so vigorously tried to implicate. The racial profiling Frank had planned as a defense strategy would not be the easy victory he anticipated. Jim Conley testifies. Quote, this Negro is no ordinary Negro. Did you notice him on the stand? What's your name? James Conley. That's the way he answered me. James. Did you notice it? It wasn't Jim. Maybe one time when he wallowed in the mire of the streets, it was Jim. But after some sinister man had shaved and bathed and pampered him and used scented soap in his hair, he was James. End quote. Luther Rosser, closing argument. With Newt Lee fully acquitting himself, it was clear that the appearance of James Jim Conley, the confessed accessory after the fact, would be the most anticipated showdown of the trial. As far as Frank's attorneys were concerned, if their client were going to be exonerated, the factory sweeper's testimony and his very character simply had to be destroyed. Prosecutor Dorsey was taking a major risk by arranging such a racial confrontation in a Southern courtroom. Quote, Negro testimony, end quote, as the courts referred to it, was simply worthless in all legal matters. Yet, for the first time in American history, Dorsey intended to use it to erect the gallows by which to hang a white man of wealth and standing. It was an astonishing departure from all Southern racial customs and uncharted legal territory. But Conley's uncanny ability to recall and relay crucial details of the crime emboldened the prosecutor to take that risk. Moving with dispatch, Dorsey continued to reconstruct the events of April 26th to establish the last known movements, actions, and words of the 13-year-old victim, Mary Fagan. Her family, her friends, and her co-workers helped chart her last 24 hours. Police first responders and detectives recounted the gruesome discovery of the body and the related clues. Dorsey meticulously laid the strands of evidentiary facts for his much-anticipated main witness to weave together. On August 4th, James Conley was called to the stand, and the sheer drama of his presence in the witness box mesmerized all of Georgia. He would be on the stand for 16 hours, longer than any other witness in state history up to that time. The black man calmly and cogently gave a riveting and unflustered account of the role his boss had instructed him to perform in the aftermath of Mary Fagan's murder. Conley's gift for recounting the details and the nuances of his experience, by all accounts, was extraordinary. It quickly became evident why Prosecutor Dorsey had placed so much confidence in the simple Negro sweeper. Through a race-fogged lens, the Atlanta Georgian reporter observed, quote, "The Negro forgot nothing, omitted nothing that he had told before. If he was telling a black lie to save his own neck from the gallows, it was still more wonderful. He had a remarkably retentive memory, or an imagination far beyond the normal, even for his notably imaginative race. So fast the words fell from his lips that the stenographers were hard put to keep up with him, and the jurors, straining forward in their seats, found difficulty in following his recital. He sat there, an uncouth, thick-lipped, ignorant Negro, but he told a story that gripped his auditors with a compelling interest that an eloquent-tongued orator could not have aroused." End quote. At its core, Conley's witness stand narrative was solid and unwavering. Attorney Luther Rosser later charged that Atlanta detectives had concocted the story and coached the Negro. But that was unlikely. Conley's minute-by-minute account was honeycombed with any number of opportunities for impeachment. For instance, here Conley tells of his prearranged meeting with Frank on the morning of the murder and his recruitment to be the lookout for his boss later that day. Note, in bold-faced type, the sheer number of witnesses Conley refers to who could have been found to dispute or deny his account. Georgians had to have understood that a coached liar would not have built into his story so many chances for exposure. Quote, "On April 26th, me and Mr. Frank met at the door. He says, 'What I want you to do is watch for me today as you did other Saturdays.' And I says, 'All right.' I said, 'Mr. Frank, I want to go to the Capital City Laundry to see my mother.' And he said, 'By the time you go to the laundry and come back to Trinity Avenue, stop at the corner of Nelson and Forsyth Streets until I go to Montague's.' I don't know exactly what time I got to the corner of Nelson and Forsyth Streets, but I came there sometime between 10 and 10:30. I saw Mr. Frank as he passed by me. I was standing on the corner. He was coming up Forsyth Street toward Nelson Street. He was going to Montague's factory. While I was there on the corner, he said, 'Ha ha, you are here, is yer?' And I says, 'Yes, sir, I am right here, Mr. Frank.' He says, 'Well, wait until I go to Mr. Siggs.'" End quote. Montague's. Quote, "I won't be very long. I'll be right back." I says, "All right, Mr. Frank, I'll be right here." I don't know how long he stayed at Montague's. He didn't say anything when he came back from Montague's, but told me to come on. Mr. Frank came out Nelson Street and down Forsyth Street toward the pencil factory, and I followed right behind. As we passed up there the grocery store, Albertson Brothers, a young man was up there with a paper sack getting some stuff out of a box on the sidewalk, and he had his little baby standing by the side of him, and just as Mr. Frank passed by him, I was a little behind Mr. Frank, and Mr. Frank said something to me, and by him looking back at me and saying something to me, he hit up against the man's baby, and the man turned around and looked to see who it was, and he looked directly in my face, but I never did catch the idea what Mr. Frank said. Mr. Frank stopped at Curtis's drugstore, corner Mitchell and Forsyth Streets, went into the soda fountain. He came out and went straight on to the factory, me right behind him." End quote. Conley has described encounters with several specific individuals, and in several specific places, before he has even arrived at the scene of the crime. He said that a number of draymen had seen him with Frank as well. And all those points of impeachment are superfluous to the murder plot and unnecessarily risky if they were untrue. In fact, area resident Hattie Waits, a white woman, said she did indeed see Frank on the street in, quote, close conversation with a Negro, end quote, verifying Conley's account. He continues discussing his prearranged meeting and the familiar task he was given by Leo Frank. Quote, I want you to watch for me like you have been doing the rest of the Saturdays. I always stayed on the first floor like I stayed the 26th of April and watched for Mr. Frank, while he and a young lady would be up on the second floor chatting. I don't know what they were doing. He only told me they wanted to chat. When young ladies would come there, I would sit down at the first floor and watch the door for him. I couldn't exactly tell how many times I have watched the door for him previous to April 26th. It has been several times that I watched for him. I don't know who would be there when I watched for him, but there would be another young man, another young lady during the time I was at the door. A lady for him and one for Mr. Frank. End quote. Conley then outlines his assignment at the factory on the day of Mary Fagan's murder. Quote, when we got to the factory, we both went on the inside, and Mr. Frank stopped me at the door, and when he stopped me at the door, he put his hand on the door and turned the door and says, you see, you turn the knob just like this, and there can't nobody come in from the outside. And I says, all right. And I walked back to a little box back there by the trash barrel. He told me to push the box up against the trash barrel and sit on it. And he says, now, there will be a young lady up here after a while, and me and her are going to chat a little. And he says, now, when the lady comes, I will stomp like I did before. And he says, that will be the lady, and you go and shut the door. And I says, all right, sir. And he says, now, when I whistle, I will be through. So you can go and unlock the door, and you come upstairs to my office then, like you were going to borrow some money. End quote. From, quote, me, and that will give the young lady time to get out. I says, all right, I will do just as you say. And I did as he said. Mr. Frank hit me a little blow on my chest and says, now, whatever you do, don't let Mr. Darley, end quote, personnel manager, quote, see you. I says, all right, I won't let him see me. Then Mr. Frank went upstairs and he said, remember to keep your eyes open. And I says, all right, I will, Mr. Frank. And I sat there on the box, and that was the last I seen of Mr. Frank until up in the day sometime. End quote. Conley then told of what he had witnessed while sitting in the first floor stairwell. The people who went up and down the staircase, the details of what they wore and what they did. He watched Mary Fagan enter the factory door and go up the stairs to Frank's office. Conley told of the events immediately preceding the murder. Mary Fagan enters. Quote, the next person that I saw was Miss Mary Perkins. That's what I call her, this lady that is dead. I don't know her name. After she went upstairs, I heard her footsteps going towards the office, and after she went in the office, I heard two people walking out of the office and going like they were coming down the steps. But they didn't come down the steps. They went back towards the metal department. After they went back there, I heard the lady scream, then I didn't hear no more. End quote. Montine Stover enters. Quote, and the next person I saw coming in there was Miss Montine Stover. She had on a pair of tennis shoes and a raincoat. She stayed there a pretty good while. It wasn't so very long, either. She came back down the steps and left. After she came back down the steps and left, I heard somebody from the metal department come running. End quote. From, quote, back there upstairs, on their tiptoes. Then I heard somebody tiptoeing back towards the metal department. After that, I kind of dozed off and went to sleep. End quote. And then Conley describes how a distraught Leo Frank confessed to him about having killed Mary Fagan. Leo Frank panics. Quote, next thing I knew, Mr. Frank was up over my head stamping, and then I went and locked the door, and sat on the box a little while, and the next thing I heard was Mr. Frank whistling. I don't know how many minutes it was after that I heard him whistle. When I heard him whistling, I went and unlocked the door just like he said, and went on up the steps. Mr. Frank was standing up there at the top of the steps, and shivering and trembling, and rubbing his hands like this. He had a little rope in his hands, a long, wide piece of cord. His eyes were large, and they looked right funny. He looked funny out of his eyes. His face was red. Yes, he had a cord in his hands just like this here cord. End quote. Frank confesses the murder to Conley. Quote, after I got up to the top of the steps, he asked me, "Did you see that little girl who passed here just a while ago?" And I told him I saw one come along there and she come back again. And then I saw another one come along there and she hasn't come back down. And he says, well, that one you say didn't come back down? She came into my office a while ago and wanted to know something about her work in my office. And I went back there to see if the little girl's work had come, and I wanted to be with the little girl, and she refused me, and I struck her, and I guess I struck her too hard, and she fell and hit her head against something, and I don't know how bad she got hurt. End quote. Conley recounted several of Frank's trysts that he had witnessed. Then Conley resumes his account of finding the body of Mary Fagan. Frank orders cover-up. Quote, he asked me if I wouldn't go back there and bring her up so that he could put her somewhere. And he said to hurry, that there would be money in it for me. When I came back there, I found the lady lying flat on her back with a rope around her neck. The cloth was also tied around her neck, and part of it was under her head, like to catch blood. I noticed the clock after I went back there and found the lady was dead, and came back and told him. The clock was 4 minutes to 1. She was dead when I went back there, and I came back and told Mr. Frank the girl was dead, and he said, shh, shh. He told me to go back there by the cotton box, get a piece of cloth, put it around her, and bring her up. End quote. Moving the body of Mary Fagan. Quote, the girl was lying flat on her back, and her hands were out this way. I put both of her hands down easily, and rolled her up in the cloth, and taken the cloth and tied her up, and started to pick her up, and I looked back a little distance and saw her hat and a piece of ribbon laying down, and her slippers, and I'd taken them and put them all in the cloth, and I ran my right arm through the cloth and tried to bring it up on my shoulder. The cloth was tied just like a person that was going to give out clothes on Monday. They get the clothes and put them on the inside of a sheet, and take each corner and tie the 4 corners together. And I run my right arm through the cloth after I tied it that way, and went to put it on my shoulder, and I found I couldn't get it on my shoulder. It was heavy. And I carried it on my arm the best I could, and when I got away from the little dressing room that was in the middle department, I let her fall, and I was scared, and I kind of jumped. And I said, Mr. Frank, you will have to help me with this girl. She is heavy. And he come and caught her by the feet, and I laid hold of her by the shoulders, and when we got her that way, I was backing. End quote. Up. Quote, and Mr. Frank had her by the feet, and Mr. Frank kind of put her on me. End quote. Taking Mary Fagan to the basement. Quote, he was nervous and trembling, and after we got up a piece from where we got her at, he let her feet drop, and then he picked her up, and we went on to the elevator. And he pulled down on one of the cords, and the elevator wouldn't go. And he said, wait, let me go in the office and get the key. And he went in the office and got the key and come back and unlocked the switchboard, and the elevator went down to the basement, and we carried her out, and I opened the cloth and rolled her out there on the floor. And Mr. Frank turned around and went on up the ladder, and I noticed her hat and slipper and piece of ribbon, and I said, Mr. Frank, what am I going to do with these things? And he said, just leave them right there. And I'd taken the things and pitches them over in front of the boiler. End quote. Back to Frank's second-floor office. Quote, and after Mr. Frank had left, I goes on over to the elevator and he said, come on up and I will catch you on the first floor. And I got on the elevator and started it to the first floor. and Mr. Frank was running up there. He didn't give me time to stop the elevator. He was so nervous and trembly, and before the elevator got to the top of the first floor, Mr. Frank made the first step onto the elevator, and by the elevator being a little down like that, he stepped down on it and hit me quite a blow right over about my chest, and that jammed me up against the elevator. And when we got near the second floor, he tried to step off before I got it to the floor, and his foot caught on the second floor as he was stepping off, and that made him stumble, and he fell back sort of against me. And he goes on and takes the keys back to his office and leaves the box unlocked. I followed him into his private office, and I sat down, and he commenced to rubbing his hands, and began to rub back his hair. And after a while he got up and said, "Jim." And I didn't say nothing. End quote. By this point, James Conley had established a logical murder scenario and timeline that corroborated key witnesses and contextualized the physical evidence. The jurors were kept at the edge of their seats and strained to take in every word, every inflection, every pause, every nuance. The courtroom audience was equally captivated and convinced that, for the first time, they were hearing the truth of Mary Fagan's murder. Conley was able to present an account of the tragedy and give it life apart from his own persona, such that even if Frank's lawyers destroyed his personal character, his story was strong enough to stand on its own merits. Leo Frank was in a position never seen in the South. A white man on the defensive. And yet, there was more to come. Be with us again next time when we present the next chapter of The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews, Volume 3. The Leo Frank Case, The Lynching of a Guilty Man. Prepared by the Historical Research Department of the Nation of Islam, Chicago, Illinois. Copyright 2016 by Latimer Associates. All rights reserved. Published in audiobook form by the American Mercury with permission of the Historical Research Department of the Nation of Islam. Of the Nation of Islam. Of the Nation of Islam.